Okay, Crystal, what are you taking a look at?
Mayor Pete got exactly what he asked for after dropping out and endorsing Biden right when President Obama told him to, playing his prescribed role in helping to crush Bernie's chances. Pete won himself a big political spot in the Biden administration, and he chose to be Secretary of Transportation. Now, Pete seems to think that this new gig is working out for him perfectly. From his Washington bubble, he thinks he's got this whole thing figured out and that he has himself perfectly set up to be the next heir to the neoliberal throne. But while Pete is measuring the drapes, the public is sharpening their pitchforks, and he doesn't even seem to notice. It's worth recalling how Pete ended up as Secretary of Transportation. You might remember that Pete did not intend to just take whatever patronage role was handed out to him. You remember this? Pete was reportedly offered a really powerful position at the helm of the Office of Management and Budget, the kind of job that someone who actually cares about change and governance would salivate over, but not a title that comes with much press acclaim or Washington limelight. And so, Pete rejected it, reportedly saying he wanted a, quote, real cabinet position, not a staff-level job. He was also considered for the position of VA secretary, but also scoffed at having responsibility for caring for our nation's veterans as beneath him as well. Ultimately, he landed on Department of Transportation, which gave him what he really wanted: the ability to fly around the country to ribbon-cutting ceremonies, raising his political profile and doling out goodies in congressional districts across the country. Now, in terms of the actual job, though, he was so incidental to the running of that agency that he apparently thought nothing of taking 2 months of paternity leave as the nation's supply chains gridlocked and inflation began to mount. Now, to me, the problem wasn't the paternity leave per se. I support new dads having time with their babies, of course. But it was pretty telling that clearly neither Pete nor anyone else in the administration thought it'd be an issue for him to be away from his desk for 2 straight months, as his agency sat at the heart of one of the nation's most urgent and critical issues. Because Pete, he was never selected to do an actual job. He was doled out his patronage position so that he might LARP governing for cable news cameras. And it has predictably been a disaster, because it turns out that running the Department of Transportation is a real job, and it's especially a real job right now. While Pete was doing press avails at ribbon-cutting ceremonies, the nation's airlines were gouging, screwing, and outright defrauding American travelers. Pete himself has been unable to escape the airline's chaos. One day after lightly scolding airline CEOs but promising no action, Pete's own flight was canceled. Now, he was headed to New York for, another big press event, touring a tunnel project that was a major priority of New York Democratic power players, people like Chuck Schumer, and giving a stamp of approval for funds to flow to that project. Now, that type of thing is easy and it's popular. What politician doesn't want new goodies in their district? Actually taking on an entrenched and well-organized industry like the airlines? Well, that's hard. And Pete did not sign up for hard. In his mind, though, he seems to think his stint as Secretary Pete is all going perfectly to plan. He thinks he's killing it. And he's too clueless to notice the mounting public rage at the airline abuses being allowed by his own agency. Pete's busy, after all, not with doing the job, but with pushing forward full steam on his own grand political ambitions. Apparently, the consummate shapeshifter is setting himself as a Michigander now, officially establishing residency in that state and planning to vote there in the fall. Now, you can see why he'd make the move. There's no way he can get elected statewide in Indiana. Michigan's a large, prominent swing state, but he can still hold on to his Midwestern shtick. He's thinking Michigan is the perfect spot to launch either a statewide run that will keep him in the presidential queue, or an actual presidential run should Biden be unable to run again. Pete is meeting with operatives, his PAC is endorsing candidates, etc., etc., etc. But he seems to have not noticed that his failures as Secretary of Transportation are kind of a devastating blow to any and all of his future ambitions. This dude had never had a real job before and didn't have a real record. In fact, to the extent that he did, his tenure as mayor of South Bend was hardly stellar, beset as it was by police racism and angry public protests. But he managed to exude some managerial abilities in his campaign, ran a modestly competent campaign, so a lot of people gave him the benefit of the doubt. This airline mess has really struck a chord among the traveling masses of regular Americans trying to take their first post-COVID vacations and getting run through a gauntlet at airports across the country. And this mess and the customary learned helplessness that is being offered in response is squarely in Pete's court. Bernie is already out humiliating him by demanding specific actions and fines for airline abuses. Pete's response? He hasn't had the time to do the math on Bernie's proposals. Translation? He doesn't care, and he has no intention of doing more than offer his weird travel agent tips online. After all, he's too busy heading to another ribbon-cutting shoot. Because while Pete thought he was signing up for a fake job, the public actually needs him to govern. Just consider the contrast to what Pete is doing with photo shoots and political glad handling versus what someone who is actually concerned with governing is approaching with their job. The general counsel for the National Labor Relations Board has turned out to be an absolute beast by contrast. She is quietly and without fanfare going after the captive audience meetings, which have become a routine part of union busting tactics. She's working to return to a prior era of labor organizing when if a majority of workers sign cards saying they want to unionize, the burden is then on the company to prove that the sentiment does not actually reflect the majority will of the bargaining unit. Her actions have been central to the boldness and success of the new grassroots labor organizing. Meanwhile, Pete is busy hobnobbing and meeting with political operatives to even notice that his failures at his job right now might preclude him from getting the job that he really wants in the future. According to Politico, Pete's confidants deny that he's using his gig as Secretary of Transportation to set himself up for a statewide or presidential campaign. As his former deputy campaign manager said, quote, "If that's what he was doing, he'd be running a shit shadow campaign." Well, I guess he does have a point there. The Michigan move, pretty interesting, you know. Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.